y'all, Melissa here with you today, and I am wearing today's project, which is a cardigan. I'm going to show you how to sew this up, and I even have a free pattern option. So check out the links below to get all the pattern details, and then I will meet you back at the camera to show you how to sew this up. Let's talk about the supplies. So I have my pattern already cut out here, and I have some buttons. I'm not going to use all of these. These are 7/8 inch buttons. Anything from 3/4 to like 1 1/4 inches should work. I have the hem band for my cardigan. These are the cuffs. I have 2 sleeves cut out, and I'm using a pretty stable sweater knit for this. I have 2 front pieces cut out, and I have the back piece here. And then I have my button band that's going to go down the front of my cardigan, and I have some interfacing. On the pattern, there is a notch on the button band, and you need to have 1.5 inch wide interfacing to put on in that area that's going to stabilize where we're going to sew the buttons and buttonholes. You'll notice that this is fusible interfacing, so I do need to fuse this on. When I do that, I'm going to go from the bottom edge to the notch, and I'm going to be 1/2 inch in, because that's my seam allowance, from the edge. So let's start with the front and back. You'll notice that my sweater knit here has one side where the texture is raised and one side where the texture is not as visible. I want this more textured side to be the right side for my cardigan. So I am going to place my 2 front pieces right sides together with my back piece. And the first step is I'm going to stitch across these shoulder seams. Now, I am using my serger to stitch these shoulder seams, but you don't need a serger. You just need a machine that can do at least a zigzag, because you need a stretch stitch for this stretch fabric. If you need to know more about stretch stitching, I do have a link below that talks more about different options for that. You'll notice I just stitched straight from one shoulder seam over to the other. So I need to clip those chains out. And then the next step is going to be to put in my sleeve. So here is one arm side across my cardigan there. And I am going to take one sleeve. And these sleeves don't have like a front and back side. They're just cut on a fold. So I am going to find the center of my sleeve here, and I want to match that to the shoulder seam. I'm going to use a clip since I'm doing this on my serger, and then the edges of the sleeves are going to get matched up to the edges of the arm side. Now, you can clip all the way along here, or you can pin. I prefer to just go ahead and leave 1 or 2 clips and feed it in and even it out as I'm putting it through the machine. If you don't have the experience to do that, then by all means, go ahead, clip, pin, whatever you need to do to get this seam straightened out. I'm going to do this on both sides of the cardigan. Once you have sewed in your sleeves, this is what it's going to look like. I've got my fronts, my back, and my 2 sleeves. And now I want to fold this to match the side seams. And then on each side, I want to match this sleeve seam that we just sewed. And then I want to match the underarm seam on my sleeve. And then I'm going to sew all the way across here. So it's all the way down the sleeve and down the side, all in one go. Okay, y'all, once I have those underarm and side seams stitched, this is what it's going to look like. And I am going to set this aside for a second, I'm going to turn it right side out first, because the next thing we are going to work on is the cuffs that we need to add to the bottoms of the sleeves. So here are my cuff pieces, and I want to show you a trick that works with cuffs and neckbands and anything that you're going to need to have wrong sides together when you're finished. So what you want to do is fold your cuff right sides together one way, like this. And then we're going to fold it the other way like this. And I'm going to sew through here. And then when I turn the whole thing right side out, the cuffs will magically be correct with all the wrong sides inside and all the right sides outside. And I've only had to sew one seam here. Okay, here is that seam stitched up. And then all I do is flip one side over, and the other side stays inside, and here is my cuff. Now, the disadvantage to this method over folding the whole cuff in half once and just sewing a seam and then kind of like rolling one side over the other is that you get a little bit of a jog here at the seam, and the thicker your fabric is, the more apparent that jog will be. When you're working with stretch fabrics like this, you can kind of push and pull and twist, and the knit will sort of absorb a lot of that, but there is still a visible little, like this side is higher than this side. If that bothers you, then don't do it this way. I find that that is barely noticeable on the finished garment, so sometimes I like to use that technique. Once you have your two cuffs, you're going to need to sew them onto the ends of your sleeves. And what we need to do is find the sleeve seam. I want to match up the cuff seam with the sleeve seam and get all three raw edges on the same side. I'm going to clip those together, those two seams. And then what you're going to do is you're going to be stretching your cuff as you stitch so that it matches up with your sleeve. So I like to kind of pre-stretch mine and match it up as much as I can, and then put a clip opposite the seam clip to kind of give me a guideline as I'm stretching. Let's take this over to the machine and you can see how I sew with the presser foot inside the circle. Okay, y'all, once we have those cuffs sewn on, we can turn them right sides out. And then we want to move to the bottom of the sweater here because we are going to be adding the hem band to this. So here's my hem band. I want to fold it in half, wrong sides together, and I'm going to pin it all along the bottom edge, or clip it in my case, along the bottom edge of the cardigan. Now, the hem band is shorter than the bottom hem in the same way that the cuffs are shorter than the sleeve, so it kind of gathers it in just a little bit. So what I want to do is match up my ends, and then I'm going to match the center back to the center of the hem band as well. So I'm just folding my hem band to mark the center back here, and I will fold the back of my cardigan, put those seam allowances together and mark. So I'm going to stitch this on my machine. I'm going to stretch the hem band just enough that it lays flat against the bottom edge of the cardigan. So here's what the hem band looks like stitched on. So the final piece we have to add on is the button band. And I'm going to start by, button band's going to get looped around like this. And I want the notched edges to get matched, and I'm going to match the notches. And you'll notice that when I do match those, that I'm going to have like a 1/2 inch of fabric hanging out below the hem band. That is as intended. So I'm going to match that up, and this part where the interfacing is, where we're gonna sew the buttonholes and the buttons, that is not going to stretch. That's why this is notched the way it is. Okay, so let's look at how this will be sewn. Down here, where we've got the non-stretch interfacing, we're not gonna stretch our stitching, and our button band is going to get sewn right to the edge without stretching. Between that notch and the center back, we are going to very gently stretch the button band to match the neckline. And we want the majority of the stretch to actually end up in this back neckline. That'll help pull it in a little bit. Okay, so here is my button band sewn on. What I want to do now is I want to fold my button band right sides together and open up that seam allowance there at the bottom. And I want to stitch, let me get this where you can see it more easily. I want to stitch right across here. I want to make sure my needle is right in line with this hemband, so that this edge is the same as this edge. Okay, y'all, here is what this looks like on mine, and I had the serger, of course, cutting off the edge of the fabric. If you used a regular sewing machine, which I actually recommend, you would want to trim that seam allowance. The reason I recommend using the regular sewing machine, it was tricky, and I actually had to unpick a couple of stitches right here on the edge of my hemband that the serger got stitched onto the edge of the headband before it got onto the button band. So this is a do as I say and not as I did kind of moment. This would, if I'm doing this again, I'm going to do this on my sewing machine, not my serger. And you'll notice that I have switched to my sewing machine, and that's because I'm going to be using this for the finishing steps of this cardigan. So I'm going to turn my button band right side out here, and I am going to, on the wrong side, pin. Now I've switched to pins. I'm going to pin the edge of my button band over the seam allowance. Here is my button band all pinned into place, and you can see how the raw edge of my fabric covers that seam allowance from the previous stitching line. Now I'm going to take this to my machine where I've got it set for a stretch stitch. That's the one that looks like a little zigzag lightning bolt. You can also use a narrow zigzag or a twin needle to do this. And I'm stitching right next to the seam line. Here is what the button band looks like once it has been top stitched in place. And then I went ahead and tried on my cardigan to mark where I wanted my buttons. Now it's important to note that I cropped this cardigan that I am making currently. It's about 3 inches shorter than the original pattern, and because of that I'm only going to use 3 buttons. If you were making it the original length, you would want 5 buttons probably. You're going to want 1 button in about the center of the hemband. And then when I tried it on, I marked where I wanted the top button based on my bust and how I wanted it to button near my bust. So the top button and the bottom button are marked, and then I just put 1 mark in the middle for my middle button since I'm only using 3. If you're using more buttons, even for 3 buttons, this tool, which I have linked below, this is called a Simflex gauge, and it's very handy for marking things like buttons, pleats, etc. without having to do math. So I'm going to take this to the machine. I'm going to go ahead and sew my buttonholes. I'm not going to get into the weeds on buttonholes today. I have a different video linked below that talks a lot more about buttonholes if you need that help. I'm also going to mention, if you chose like a sweater knit like what I'm wearing, then you may want to hand sew the buttonholes. This one has hand sewn buttonholes on it because this knit was just too thin and not working well with the buttonholer on my sewing machine. I strongly encourage you to try a buttonhole on a scrap of fabric before you do this on your cardigan so that you don't mess anything up. y'all, here is my cardigan. I've gone ahead and I stitched the buttonholes and I used my machine to stitch the buttons on. If you want to know more about that, I have that linked below as well. And now I am all finished with this. So in my next video, I'm going to be showing you how I used a throw blanket to make the cardigan that I am wearing and how I cut things a little bit differently to take advantage of things like the ribbing that was on the throw blanket. Meanwhile, check out this playlist for more garment sewing tutorials so that you can make a wardrobe all your own.